Hello and welcome to Ye Old Entertainment, and today we are going to be adding a few titles to our tier maker ranking of cart battlers and cart battler adjacent games. And some of these titles were recommended by you guys. This time we're going to go from the ones that I like the most to the ones that I like the least. So without further ado, let's get to it. Coming up first is Wildfrost, and man, you guys were definitely on the money with this one. This one is one of the best cart battlers that I've ever played, and if I hadn't played it before, it's because I wasn't crazy about the visual aspect of the game. It looked a little bit too cutesy for me, and some of the negative criticism on Steam put me off a little bit, but I am glad I gave it a shot. Wildfrost is definitely not for beginners though. This game floods you with mechanics from the very get-go. There is no gradual assimilation of the game's mechanics. Right out of the gates, you are required to be 100% familiar with the genre, and during the first couple of encounters you have to deal with stuff like reinforcements, damage over time, reflect damage, pierce damage, incapacitation, etc. Also, your deck has some pretty complex cards and stuff that you need to sink your teeth into almost immediately. But there is a lot to like about Wildfrost, and these are some of the things that I personally love. First, no encounter feels like a throwaway trash mob encounter. It feels like a boss rush, like the Wukong of cart battlers almost. Maybe because every encounter actually has a boss of sorts. Second, it's not at all derivative of Slay the Spire. You don't have cards that cost X energy that you drag and drop onto opponents or allies. It's a completely different thing, and that alone gives it extra points. Third, card mechanics are deep and synergies feel super powerful and satisfying. And it also has a deep strategic dimension. Fourth, you have different factions, and they all feel truly different to play, which is not the case with most of these games. You need to wrap your head around what they do and the different mechanics at their disposal. Fifth, production values are actually pretty good. And sixth, no spoiler I guess, but what they devised for the final encounter of the game is just sheer brilliance. I am not too crazy about how the meta progression works though. You have a little stronghold with different little facilities, so to speak, and you would think that you get to upgrade them according to what you think is best, but that's not how it works. These facilities are there for you just to check on your progress, so to speak. There's nothing for you to decide because every upgrade happens automatically when the conditions are met, and the conditions are stuff like killing X type of enemy with X attack or using such and such skills X number of times, etc. And I was not necessarily a fan of this. But yes, this one is definitely going to go into the good tier, and it's going to be very high indeed. It has deeper and overall better mechanics than some of these titles, but I still think the fun factor in Death Roads is superior, and the RPG and story elements in Griftlands would make me choose those over Wildfrost if I had to choose, but it's still a phenomenal game in my book. Then we have Fight in Tight Spaces, because fighting in tight spaces is tight. This one I knew before you guys reminded me of its existence in the comment section of that video, but I had just forgotten about it because it really didn't captivate me at the time. I went back to it and did a hideous job showing it to you over on Cart Battle Saturday because I had just forgotten how to play it. But since then I've picked it up again, I've relearned how to play it, and I've been having fun with it. Fight in Tight Spaces has many things going for it. For starters, it's not trying to be Slay the Spire. It has completely different mechanics, and it leans heavily into the tactical puzzle-solving experience. Each combat encounter requires you to take into account level design, your position on the grid, your enemy talents, and your own cards at all times. You also have your standard card battler features, like a map Slay the Spire style in which you have to decide which node to go to next, There is a node that allows you to upgrade or destroy some of the cards that you already have. There is a node that allows you to heal or to increase your maximum level, etc. You also get 3 agents that you can choose from at the beginning of the run, and each of them has a variety of decks that entail different strategic approaches. So it is pretty solid, I would say. There's also a cool John Wick vibe to it that I can always appreciate. However, there are a couple of design choices that I wasn't crazy about, but your mileage may vary depending on what you look for in a card battler. First, I get that some of these games are meant to be more tactical, and Fight in Tight Spaces is one of those, just like Cobalt Core. But Cobalt Core just sits in that sweet spot in which the array of variables that you factor in for every fight is numerous enough to keep things challenging and fun, but not enough to get you in a situation of analysis paralysis. But I don't feel like that's the case with Fight in Tight Spaces. This game can get exhausting. It's not a game to kill time casually, and maps can feel very extremely long because the fights can be long. Though I will tell you that straight out one-shotting enemies by pushing them out of rooms or kicking them over rails gives you a feeling of satisfaction that few other games on this list achieve. Especially since you can even one-shot bosses if you play your cards right. No pun intended. Also, the music for combat encounters can get sickeningly repetitive, and it's not great to begin with. So yes, Fight in Tight Spaces can be a little bit taxing because of the attention that you have to pay at all times. Maps can feel a little too big, and it's a little bit frustrating when you die in mission 4 or 5. The music can get annoying at times, and it is a little bit pricey. But it's still one of the better games on this list, and that's why it's going to go into the good tier as well. And if you like the premise of a John Wick guy taking out waves of enemies that has card battler mechanics and a slew of variables to take into account at all times, then know that there is a new game coming out by these same guys that's called Knights in Tight Spaces. Then we have Deepest Chamber, and this one is deceptively addictive, fun, and challenging. It's a party-based dungeon crawler card battler, which means that it also ticks many of the boxes of the RPG crowd. There are party members for you to unlock, and they all have unique individual mechanics which also synergize with every other party member's skills in interesting different ways. And the game knows how to encourage you to try different combinations of characters because it keeps record of all your victories and who you achieve them with. You can also equip gear on your character's RPG style. You can gather resources with which you can craft potions and other stuff. There are vendors. It's actually pretty cool in an RPG way. Some of this stuff, however, you can only do at the beginning of the run, and I wish you could do them all the way through, a bit like you do in Darkest Dungeon 2. One thing that I like about Darkest Dungeon 2 is that every act feels like an agonizing trip to the next inn. A trip that you can only survive if you take good decisions both in and outside combat encounters. And that's because the game's resource management is crucial. And I kinda wish it were in Deepest Chamber as well. You do run into some vendors and events, but they feel a little bit like an afterthought and not something to take into account as part of your plan to navigate the Slay the Spire map the game has to offer. The game has interesting innovative card mechanics, and that sets it apart from the endless march of Slay the Spire clones, and I can greatly appreciate that. Cards themselves are also interesting, and some of them go beyond the typical damage and blocking functions, especially with the characters that you unlock later on in the game. You have damage over time, several different conditions and effects, and there's a solid build aspect to the game. Character models and animations are also very decent for a budget indie title. Also, enemy variety is quite impressive, and your battle tactics need to revolve around what your enemies do, and they do all sorts of things, which is a good thing. There are aspects of this game that feel painfully amateurish though, and many of them have to do with the user interface and the user experience as a whole. The choice of fonts, the UI, the choice of icons, the way it prompts you, for example, to left click when there's also a continue button. The fact that you can drag and drop cards that don't require a target, the fact that there are cards that target other cards, but you need to double click on them, choose a card, and then click on a poorly placed continue button. The baffling lack of consistency of the UI design with the game's visual personality, it's crazy bad. The game is still playable, of course, but it feels just too freaking amateurish and poor. Also, one of the reasons that I cared about the characters in Darkest Dungeon 2 was that they all had a debt that they needed to settle with themselves or the world. There was always this horrible thing that they should have done, this one core of guilt that wouldn't go away. You face confessions in Darkest Dungeon 2, and it feels like confessions are relevant to your party members' sins. In Deepest Chamber, you also unlock characters, but while they feel distinct and quirky, I don't feel like any of them is on a journey of completion or anything like that. And I think that's a huge wasted opportunity. Deepest Chamber is a meh game in my book, but it's one of the better ones on this tier. So I am going to put it somewhere near the top of the tier because I had, and I am still having, quite a bit of fun with it. Then we have Peglin, which is a ball battler more than a card battler. And this is a very original one, and it kept me glued to my chair for a couple of days. This one is a weird combination between card battler and Super Breakout meets pinball, I guess. It's the only game on this list that requires a bit of thumb-eye coordination, because sometimes you have spinning ball launchers and moving platforms that you have to aim at. But you really win this game consistently by building your deck with the right balls. And there's an interesting build aspect to this game, though it could have been a little bit deeper. In addition to your balls, which again work like your cards in other card battlers, you have relics, just as you do in Slay the Spire, and you'd be wise to look for ways to make your relics and your balls work in synergy to be able to consistently defeat all the bad guys. I like the game's Super Breakout mechanics. They feel fresh and original, and I like that you even use them to get around the map. The game also has a dad joke approach to humor, and I have a soft spot for that, I'm not gonna lie. Also, I think the music in this title is awesome. Like, I play air instruments all the way through kinda awesome. But there are a couple of things that keep this game from reaching its full potential in my opinion. First, I think the maps feel a little bit too big, although they aren't as big as they usually are in your average card battler. But there is something that makes them feel a little bit tedious. Maybe it's the same-ishness of the enemies, and speaking of those, they are lacking in variety in terms of the attacks that they have. They have melee attacks, ranged attacks, some form of damage over time, and some enemies have shields. That's it, except bosses. Bosses are a little bit more interesting, and they tend to mess around with your tactics a little more. But don't expect anything along the lines of bosses in Beneath Arrest or Slay the Spire. What I mean is that you don't plan your fight around what enemies do, and that's not a good thing in this type of game. Also, the characters that you unlock aren't that much different from each other. They have different starting balls and maybe a different relic, I don't remember. But they all use the same mechanics, which doesn't add great replay value. So all in all, while fun and innovative, it's still very much a meh game. So that's where I am going to put it. Then we have Library of Ruina. This was another recurrent recommendation that you guys had in the comment section, and don't take this the wrong way, but those who recommended this game in the comment section, I think you guys came to the wrong neighborhood. See, in my book, more often than not, Japanese and Korean games, or even games that feature anime-inspired aesthetics, they tend to be a checklist of everything that I loathe in video games, in almost every respect. The story tends to be a 101 manual on bad writing, the gameplay tends to be sickeningly on rails, player agency and emergent gameplay are nowhere to be found, and they are tremendously overpriced. And Library of Ruina, unfortunately, is all of these things. I'm sorry guys, but I disliked every single thing about it. First, those of you who say that the story is the best story you're ever going to play must have played a completely different game. First, I believe the word verbose that is so commonly used when talking about these games has to be purged from the discussion. Because people use verbose to refer to an unnecessary information dump about the character's backgrounds, the setting, or the story that is used as a substitute to actual world building and storytelling. It's 100% telling instead of showing, which is a cardinal sin in writing. I take it as a disrespect to the audience's intellect, because this way to tell a story assumes that the audience is completely incapable of connecting the dots and piecing together what's going on. Also, characters' personalities swing wildly from cruel and unforgiving to naive and undecisive when the plot needs it, and the mystery aspect of the game is reduced to a series of mystery boxes. And mystery boxes are another big no-no. The initial musical introduction couldn't have been more cringe if it had tried, and I find it funny that one of the characters says that I have no time for your verbose explanations. And literally everything she does in the game is a lengthy verbose explanation. Also, the game reiterates constantly about shit that you already know, which stretches the already convoluted dialogue to insufferable lengths. But what about the mechanics of the game? Well, there is an actual deck building aspect to this game, in the sense that you collect cards and discard them, and you are supposed to choose those cards that better serve your character's overarching strategy, and that alone makes it a far better title than Voice of Cards, Beast of Burden. But it's still incredibly shallow compared to games like Wildfrost, Vault of the Void, and even other meh-tier games like Deliverance and Reign. And throw in bad RNG mechanics and you have the recipe for a frustrating game that doesn't feel good to play. And when I say RNG, I'm not talking about random card rewards or any other random stuff that you've come to expect in the genre. I'm talking about dice rolls that can totally destroy you or make you win an encounter effortlessly. Also, the game is unnecessarily convoluted in every respect, and that includes its mechanics. Wildfrost is, 10 times harder, 10 times more complex in terms of its mechanics, but the learning curve in terms of the user experience is basically pick up and go. The user experience in Library of Ruina is atrocious. It's overly and unnecessarily complicated, and it feels as though the developers never played a card battler, or a card game for that matter, in their life. And before you dweebs start saying, actually, know that that is not the case. I know these developers have made some other card games. I'm just saying this is how this game feels to me. And yes, the price is absolutely ridiculous. If you are a Ryu, and you only care about tactical challenge and complex and gratifying card mechanics, this game is not for you. If you are into story-based card battlers, unless you like your verbose story, this game is not for you. Go play Griftlands, Tainted Grail Conquest, or Black Book instead. Even if you're all about the mystery, which is supposed to be this game's selling point, avoid it. Go play Inscription instead. Bottom line is, avoid Library of Ruina at all costs. That would be my advice. So this one is going to go all the way to the bottom, along with Voice of Cards, Beast of Burden. And no guys, for future recommendations, that any game along the lines of Library of Ruina, Voice of Cards, etc. is very likely going to end up in the bottom tier. There are a few exceptions to this, of course, but that's what they are, exceptions. So let's take one final look at our tier maker. Maybe not final, because we are probably going to add more titles to it, but as it stands now, we have 4 titles on the great tier, starting with Tainted Grail Conquest, which is a personal favorite of mine, Slay the Spire, which is everyone's personal favorite, Monster Train, and that first game that you absolutely have to try out, Beneath Oresa. On the good tier, we have Death Road, another personal favorite of mine, Griftlands, which hopefully I will be making a video about in the days to come, or at least before the year ends, Wildfrost, which was recommended by you guys in the comment section of the last Card Battler video, Black Book, Rogue Book, Gordian Quest, Vault of the Void, Fight in Tight Spaces, which we added today, Inscription, and Cobalt Core. On the meh tier, we have Power Chord, Midnight Suns, Deep Sky Derelicts, Deepest Chamber, which we added today, the sensationally overrated Balatro, in my opinion at least, Acolyte of the Altar, the Corpseman, Knock on the Coffin Lid, Peglin, which we also added today, Deliverance and Reign, and Divinity Chronicle, Journey to the West. On the bad tier, we have Across the Obelisk, Dragon Eclipse, Nadir, Rogue Femme, yes, we don't discriminate against porn games here, and the Card Battler adjacent Ash of Gods, The Way, which I understand is a spin-off of The Way, and Hadean closes that tier. And then on the ugly tier, we have Library of Ruina and Voice of Cards, Beast of Burden. Remember, we have Card Battler and Card Battler adjacent games, and that's why you see titles there like Midnight Suns, Deep Sky Derelict, Balatro, and some other titles that aren't strictly Card Battlers, but that provide a similar experience. Well, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing. I am only 60-ish people away from the 10K mark, and it'd be amazing if I could reach it before the end of the year. Come check us out on Discord. If you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there, remember, it's a boomer channel. And if you aren't a boomer, you're probably not going to feel too comfortable there. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye, everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.